Okay. I actually just decided to stop the other video. That way it was a little bit cleaner to just start by talking about the slides here. So, prices, production, and unemployment. I've now talked to you sufficiently about prices. Let's just briefly talk about unemployment. Unemployment is one of those issues that, generally speaking, um, makes a lot of news headlines, people out of work. And obviously, we saw that during COVID. Um, the data is pretty messy because people don't work the way they used to work anymore. By that, I mean that people serve as contractors, so then they might not typically be traditionally considered unemployed. Additionally, um, individuals have like side hustles, they can do Uber, other kinds of things. So the traditional employment relationship that we knew of in the past isn't there anymore, which makes measuring unemployment a little bit more difficult. Um, but if we look at this very briefly here, when we look at the Federal Reserve Economic Database, Fred, and we just look at what's called the U3 statistic, which is the unemployment rate that we typically look at, that right now it's 5.4%. A pretty dramatic fall from its peak at nearly 15%. And actually, it was much higher than that. It just turned out that there was a bad survey instrument that people said that they were returning to their job after the pandemic ended, which then meant that they weren't considered unemployed because they were returning to their job. When in actuality, they were not. Um, But as you see here, the unemployment rate is still persistently higher, 5.4% nationally, than it was before the pandemic. So, um, if we localize that to Hawaii, if my memory serves me right, we are at about 7%, maybe 8%. It could be as high as 8%. So I'm going to go on the DBEDT website for Hawaii. The alternative would be that at Manoa, we obviously have UHERO, which also collects a great deal of data. So, yeah, about 7%. With most of the decrease in unemployment coming from increases in accommodations, which obviously is driving the Hawaii economy. Okay. And then we have GDP. Only because we're here and we can look at this rather easily here. We can see that the global pandemic obviously had a dramatic effect on the GDP level of production in Hawaii, falling dramatically because people stopped visiting. Okay. Which then led to this article that I was reading here in the Star Advertiser, where economists were lowering um, production level growth in Hawaii because the Delta variant of COVID is causing people to not come here as much as economists had expected them to come. Okay, let's start looking at the slides now. So those are our three things: production, prices, and unemployment. And what this chapter is largely going to serve as is a review of what um, you had done in Econ 131 already. So in terms of GDP, When we look at it, we can measure it in one of two ways. But regardless of the way that you measure it, you should get the same number. You could either define it as how much is being spent, which is the primary way that in Econ 131 that we look at it, where it's consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. C plus I plus G plus NX, which you probably remember from, again, from principles. The alternative way to do it, which we don't always look at in principles, would be to look at total income. And you then basically look at all the um, factors of production that receive some level of income and you add that all up. It should equal the same as spending. And that's what you kind of see here. That whether you look at it from a spending perspective or from a income perspective, they should be the same. And that's largely because of the circular flow diagram, which again, you probably became at least introduced to um, in 131. And again, I'm keeping in mind here, you can read slides, and I hope you're reading the textbook as well. So you don't need to really read it, um, read slides for you here. Now, within each stage of production, there is some value that's added. That value added to the intermediate goods is what gives us the final goods and services. So, those final goods and services would be things like um, General Motors buying leather that they then put into the seats of a new car, right? The leather was the intermediate good that ended up being used in the final good. And you can see this here. You don't need me to read it for you. Which then basically means that you can add that GDP can either be, now it can't be both, but can either be you just taking the value of all the final goods produced, or you can sum up the value of everything in production. Or to put it another way, I can either add up all the cars produced. Let's just say I have a one good economy where it's just cars being produced. I can add up all the cars, or I can add up all the rubber that went into the tires. I can add up all the leather that came from cows to make the seats. I can use all the steel that's used to make the car, et cetera, right? And if I add that all up, that should equal the same amount as adding up the value of all the cars. This again is what you should have seen in Econ 131. If we take the expenditure approach to GDP, that would be C plus I plus G plus NX. Consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports, equaling the final output. Let's look at consumption first. So, consumption, we're really talking about households that buy goods and services. This is the biggest part of GDP in the United States. 70%, about 72% to be precise. So, 72% of US GDP is all consumption, and it's primarily services. Durable goods and non durable goods, um, much smaller. We are largely a service based economy that's driving all this. So if we look at COVID, when you do a lockdown, that stops people from consuming as much as they used to. And that's obviously then why you see the economy showing steep declines in GDP. Because either people are out of a job, so they're no longer willing to buy stuff because they have no money, or quite simply, they can't even go out there to buy stuff anymore. This is kind of old data, and I never really like old data, but um, let's look at the updates on this. So yeah, like I said, it's actually higher than 68% here. Let's look at see if we can get some better data here. Now, what the Federal Reserve Economic Database does is it basically searches all the trusted economic data sources to get us the data that we're putting in here. And so here we can see, again, that dramatic recovery after COVID, such that it's now close to $16 trillion for personal consumption expenditures. And should be about 16 trillion. Search instead for rump. I don't think that's going to get me anything. Yeah, so what are we looking at here? Yeah, it's about 71, 72%. This is to quarter two, so we don't get all the dramatic things that happened a little bit later here. And we're looking at personal consumption expenditures, PCE, rather than C, just general consumption. It's higher than the 68.2% that we saw in 2014. Then investment, what we're looking at here is businesses buying physical assets for future production. Of these components, business fixed, residential fixed, which would be you and I buying houses, and inventory. Inventory is the most volatile. And you obviously would have seen that as well during COVID, where companies drew down their inventory levels, or where now they can't recover their inventory. And you can see that in general, that equals about 17% of the economy. Now, we are going to see in later chapters that this level of investment actually, the level of investment by businesses drives the economic growth in the economy. And so as a result, governments, generally speaking, will encourage businesses through tax policy to engage in investment spending. We have stocks and flows. That's important to remember here too. We have the total amount of investment that's made that serves as our stock, and then the flow would be the amount that changes by over time. So investment loses value over time from depreciation. The capital becomes worn out, but it can also increase as you invest more in that product to maintain it. And that just gives you an idea of this concept of stock versus flow. You'll see that that's going to become important here, especially in later chapters. Then we've got government spending on goods and services. The most important thing to remember here is not does not include transfer payments. Let me give you an example here. Um, One of the interesting things that the Biden administration has been doing since he took office is he's been increasing um, government purchases of goods and services for the poor. One example would be is that right now, in case you didn't know it, and so if that's the case, you should apply for this. If you're on Medicaid or if you're on food stamps, um, the government right now, the federal government, has if you qualify for the program, you can get a $50 subsidy towards high speed internet. Essentially, the government is giving individuals $50 of internet, right, if you qualify for the program. That would count as government spending on a good or service. When the government also gives more money in food stamps, for instance, that would count as government spending because the government is spending money on food that then people then consume. What is not part of government spending would be if I get like a social security payment or if I get a stipend because I'm a veteran. That's just getting money, right? Or unemployment insurance, as is given in this example here. So there's a big difference between government spending on goods and services and transfer payments. Transfer payments are not part of the GDP because if you counted them, the problem would be is that then I do spend that money on goods and services when I receive that money. So then we would end up double counting things. And we can see that government spending is about the same amount as a total as investment. But interestingly, as you'll see here in this graph here, or in this table here, state and local spending is much more than federal. So it does often make me wonder, and this has been true for a pretty long period of time, it often makes me wonder why, in the media and all this stuff, it's all consumed by these debates about federal spending rather than state and local spending, when it's really state and local spending that we should be focusing our attention on. That'd be everything from schooling to fire to police to emergency services to this university. That's a whole bunch of money right there. You should also take note here that the federal government spends almost twice as much on defense as non defense. And the reason why that then becomes important is again when we have all these debates about um, government spending, we seem to really focus on non-defense rather than defense. And I'm not advocating that we cut things or even spend more on things. I'm just saying if we're going to debate these things, let's try to debate the numbers as they really are. And it would seem to be the case that um, the spending out there is really located and oriented around state and local spending or defense spending at the federal level. And then finally, we have net exports. That would just be your exports minus your imports, where your exports are the things that we sell to other countries, the biggest export in the United States being airplanes. minus what we import from other countries, what we buy from other countries. And those things are, basically everything, lots of consumer goods that we buy. We have a trade deficit in the United States, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But as you can see here, and even though this data is from 2014, it essentially just means that we have that we're importing more than we're exporting. If we want to update the data here, what we would see is that during the pandemic, that the trade deficit net exports has grown increasingly negative. In fact, it's historically negative, primarily because the U.S. economy is recovering faster than other countries are, and that recovery means that we're buying more of those other countries' goods, whereas other countries are not buying as much of our goods. Now, um, when something is not sold, it's counted as inventory. That inventory investment can then translate into production in future time periods. Um, it becomes um, a bit volatile. How those inventory levels are built up over time, which then leads to being able to predict um, future recessions based on how the inventory levels are changing over time. Okay, so as it says here, GDP is important because you do get again those measures of income output, expenditures, and the value added approach. It's a bit old fashioned to talk about GNP rather than GDP. GDP is primarily what we're going to talk about here. We're talking about where geographically is the production occurring. And if the production is geographically occurring in the United States, it's then counted as part of the GDP. Um, GNP is where we count things based on, um, you know, it's when we count things based on a country's citizens. And if the citizens are located in a different country, then they're producing that stuff, that will count as a country's GNP. It's just pretty complicated. I'm not sure what it really tells us. GDP is primarily what we'd be using here in the United States. The only time when that would become useful, which is our discussion question here, would be if you have a country where a fairly large amount of the population um, moves outside of that country to work and then sends the money home. So, examples of that would be something like, let's see here. Well, in some of the poorer EU countries, Eurozone countries like Greece, for instance, or Portugal, um, people can work freely within the EU zone, within the European, within other European countries, and so rather than a worker get a low wage in Portugal, they probably move to Spain or to England or to Germany, work, and then send the money home. It would make Portugal's GDP look smaller because that person moved to Germany to work. But if we looked at it from a GNP perspective, that person's production in Germany would count for Portugal's GNP because it's made by a Portuguese citizen. Greece, another good example where you have a pretty big difference between GNP and GDP. Bangladesh, Japan, we have some pretty dramatic differences based on um, citizens of that country not necessarily living in that country. Now, for the most part, we would focus on real GDP. Real GDP means that we're going to control for the prices over time. And we're going to take prices in terms of a base year price. With nominal GDP, we allow the price to change. And the problem would be is that nominal GDP then can change based on the price level changing or the quantity changing or both, which then becomes problematic because when you're looking at GDP, you probably really only care about the production levels changing. So if instead I had a base year price, then all that I'm doing is I'm saying the only way that real GDP can change is if the production levels change. And you can kind of see that with this kind of simple example here, which you can solve here. And I just said this. Again, changes in the nominal GDP could be either from the changes in the prices or from the changes in the levels of production. Now, the point where those two cross would be in 2009, because this real GDP is in terms of 2009 prices. Now, what that does for us is then if we compare nominal GDP to real GDP, we can actually calculate what's known as the GDP deflator number. And then we can calculate percentage changes in the GDP deflator to calculate what the change in the price levels would be over time. And you can calculate some of these things here. And again, I don't want to, I can't, because we're talking about this on a computer here. I can't really draw some of these things out here, but I'll make a separate video that does that. So I'm just skipping some of these slides here, but I'm not saying that you shouldn't be looking at them as well. I'm hoping that you remember some of the very simple arithmetic that accompanies how to calculate these things. Every now and then, we do change the base year price. So we basically the more often we update it, if we update it every year, we can calculate a chain weighted real GDP, and that's probably the most accurate measure of real GDP that we have. And yeah, I mean, it's more accurate because then um, we're not we're allowing by allowing that base year price to change every year, um, the base year to change every year. You're controlling for any of the uniqueness of that particular year that you chose to be the base year. And then the other way that you typically see that inflation is measured is with the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. And that basically is looking at what a typical household buys in a month. How is that changing? Um, it's important because um, union contracts use this. Big contracts for like big buildings, big infrastructure projects usually have a cost of living adjustment, a COLA. And if we look at that, we would see that the index number has been growing, and that certainly the um, angle of the increase has changed. In fact, you can kind of see these kind of inflection points here where it's get a little bit less steep here more recently, maybe because of working through those supply chain difficulties, or maybe because of the Delta variant. We don't really know. The way that we would calculate this index number is that we would um, determine what our basket of goods is going to consist of, and then we would measure how much does it cost to buy that basket of goods in a base year, and then how much does it cost to um, buy that same basket of goods in a different year. Divide those two by each other, multiply by 100, and you get the index number. And there's a simple example here with the information here. If we look at what is in then the CPI, for the most part, it is housing. So when we look at the dramatic increases that have been occurring during the COVID era, part of the problem that we're seeing is that because we've got this like real estate bubble that certainly we see in Hawaii, but we see craziness in the housing market right now. It leads to dramatically higher rents. It leads to dramatically growing housing prices. And then what the CPI does is that basically when someone buys a house, an economist thinks of that person then basically renting it to themselves. But if the housing prices are rising, basically the implied rent, the rent that I pay myself, would increase as well. Well, that's the most part of what's going on here. Is increases in the price of housing. Now, CPI is not perfect. Um, we know that some of the things are like the substitution bias. Because it is a fixed basket of goods, we generally presume um, that consumers are not going to substitute away from a good that's becoming more expensive. They're just always going to buy the same quantities of that product, which we know is not realistic because people do substitute away from goods that are becoming more expensive. CPI also doesn't bring in immediately new goods and services. So, to some extent, it's not going to reflect newly introduced products. And then there's also just changes in quality. As an example, my father tells the story of when he bought his first new car, and that the car cost $3,000. I remember this car from when I was growing up. It was a pretty junky car. It broke down pretty often. It had a basic AM radio, did not have any airbags, um, and it lasted about 10 years before it finally broke. And cars are obviously much more expensive today, but I would argue they're also of higher quality than that same vehicle was in the past. Um, there have been efforts to reduce the amount of the substitution bias. Um, that's what Mankiw's talking about here, and he talks about in the book. Just know that economists are always trying to make the number more accurate every year. Now, we've now done two different ways of measuring um, how we could look at changes in prices. One being changes in the CPI, which we just looked at, and the other being um, changes in the GDP deflator as a way to measure um, changes in prices. Then, if you look at the personal consumption expenditure, that was the thing that I looked at earlier. Um, the personal consumption expenditure, um, it does include imported goods. That's why you saw that number was higher. Um, and even though, if I'm going off my memory, right, it was like 16 trillion over 19 trillion, so it was something like 90 some percent. But what did I say? I still said it was something like 70%. Well, that's because there's a huge chunk of it that was imported goods and whatnot. Um, Generally speaking, um, the Federal Reserve tries to look at the personal consumption deflator, which is coming from the PCE, rather than the GDP deflator or even CPI. And you see this here. The two generally follow each other, but in general, the Federal Reserve looks at the personal consumption expenditure deflator, the red line, or sorry, the green line, rather than the red line CPI. And then the final thing we have here is the unemployment rate. To understand unemployment, what we do is we um, define individuals by category, and those categories would be employed, unemployed, labor force, and not in the labor force. And so individuals in the population, they have to be split up. And so we're not going to count people who are under 16. We're not going to count people who are in prison. We're not going to count people who are like, um, you know, in a nursing home or, committed in some way. And so that gives us our civilian, non-institutional population. So then we divide the civilian, non-institutional population into labor force and not in the labor force. And then the labor force is subdivided into employed and unemployed. You, as a student, if you're just focused on trying to get out of school as fast as you can and you're not carrying a job, you would not be considered unemployed. Rather, you're counted as not in the labor force. So, if you remember from principles, we see actually a great deal of movement between the unemployed and the not in the labor force category. That when the economy is, well, um, I'll say this, and again, you don't have to agree with me as an economist or as a person. I really, it doesn't bother me if you disagree with me. Um, but there was all this talk in Hawaii about why couldn't restaurants find the people to work there anymore? Like, if you asked restaurants, they always seem to say, dude, workers are lazy. They're getting all this money in unemployment benefits, so why would they bother to come to work when they can get just as much from unemployment? So then they pushed EGA and they pushed the federal government to end all of that unemployment insurance because they thought that people with all this huge amount of unemployment insurance money without a similar restriction to have to look for work meant that people were not going to look for work, which meant that they were not in the labor force. And so the businesses thought that if they pushed EGA and they pushed others to end all that extra unemployment, it would push people to start looking for work. Turns out the data suggests that it has not done that. I'm just going to go to Google News here as the best way to. I'd seen an article that um, I can't find it that quickly, I guess, but this is a pretty reputable source from The Economist. And this would be from today. Um, I can't really read the article, but it's basically saying that it did not push people to start looking for work. I'm guessing that guy is unemployed. Poor guy. Got a pretty cool hat, though, huh? What's he reading there, huh? What's he reading? Can't see. Dude, who's buying that jacket? Shirt? What is that? Crazy person. Uh, Maybe not crazy, but I certainly can't pull it off. Okay. Um, the unemployment rate would then be the percentage of the labor force that is counted as unemployed. Probably one of the most dramatic things about COVID has been the dramatic decline in the labor force participation rate. Let's look at that. And look at that pretty dramatic decline. People are just saying, that they don't want to be a part of a labor force that has this much disease in it. Um, and when we say that there's a shortage of workers, we can largely see that in this labor force participation rate, which is lower. I mean, look at this, how much historically this has changed from the late 90s, early 2000s, when the labor force participation rate was over 65%, 67%. And today is 61%, 62%. And during the worst part of the pandemic, it was as low as like 60%. It's pretty bad. You'd have to go all the way back to when women were largely kept out of the workplace, thus meaning that they were not participating in the labor force. And then as women were brought into the labor force, encouraged to work, or at least, not shunned for choosing to work, where you see that dramatic increase. But now you're seeing from both men and women people saying, well, it's maybe not good that both parents are working, or maybe it's not good that, we're not taking care of our children, or maybe it's not good to be working. Why don't I just, like there's that like whole FIRE movement, financially independent, something. I forget what the acronym stands for, but it's like people say they're going to get to age 35, save $1 million, and they're going to retire at age 35. Well, that would then mean that they're no longer part of the labor force. And you've got then these kind of simple statistics again that you can calculate here. The other way to calculate unemployment is you could conduct the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, does calculate does conduct a establishment survey where they ask businesses how many workers do you have. Um, it's just not used as much as the U3 statistic of unemployment. And we can compare these two. And we see more or less continuity between the two. Okay, so that gives you an overview of something hopefully that you've already talked about. You kind of remember from principles. There's really nothing new in this chapter. This was just really a review.